Peter McConnell, welcome to Tech Talk with Daniel Albu.
Thanks, Daniel. It's great to be here.
First of all, I want to thank you for taking the time to join me for a conversation today. Most people know you as the composer of numerous LucasArts and Double Fine games, but for me, you'll always be first and foremost the voice of Yoda in Super Star Wars The Empire Strikes Back.
Bring that up, you had to.
But before we talk in length about you being Yoda, let's go back to the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
How did you get into music?
Kind of by being born. When I really am going to start from the beginning here. When I was an infant, I had a condition that pretty much took away my voice for a while, and we were living in Switzerland at the time, actually, and we just moved there because my father was studying theology at Basel University, and as it happened, this condition I had got worse and worse, and we just happened to live down the street from the best ear, nose, and throat clinic in the world. So that was very providential for me. And after some surgeries and stuff, I was pretty much without a voice for, 6 months or so, or something like that. And when they finally took the cannula out, I had a tracheotomy. And when they finally took the cannula out, and I wasn't completely without a voice. It was kind of like that, The first thing I did was sing. And I was basically seeing Mozart before I could talk. And I think that was, so my mom says, okay. And I think that music always was a comfort for me and a form of expression that was like a refuge from everything else in some ways. And, we moved to the States. We lived in different places in the States, Kentucky and Kansas and New Jersey. I thought I was going to be a scientist by the time I was a little older, but I was always doing music in some way. I was playing violin, or I taught myself to play banjo and guitar. And when I went to college, I had kind of a moment of reckoning where I realized that, no, I did not want to be a physicist. I actually wanted to be a musician. And it was a long road to get there. I first of all did switch to music. I studied with, this was at Harvard back in the early 80s. And I studied with a guy named Ivan Sharapnin, who was his grandfather was a great Russian composer, and he was a very notable electronic music composer. And so that's really where I learned my studio chops, such as they are, was from Ivan. And I also studied with a fellow named Kurt Cacioppo, who's a classical music composer. So I had a lot of sort of the classical side, right, but also kind of a folk and rock and roll side that's pretty strong, because that's the music I was playing mostly for myself was more in that vein. And then after college, in last couple of years in college, my housemate, I lived off campus for a while, was a guy named Michael Land, and we played in bands together. And after college, we got jobs at a place called Lexicon, which is they make audio gear for musicians, black boxes that musicians play their instruments through. And we learned more or less how to code on the job, but I had a little bit of computer training in college. And Michael moved out west and got a job at LucasArts. He actually answered a newspaper ad. Those are sort of not really a thing anymore, but he answered an ad, which ended up having him start the audio department at Lucasfilm Games, as it was then known. And we had a plan, along with a friend of ours, Clint Pachakian, to start a band in San Francisco. And by the time I was still working at Lexicon when Michael moved out here. By the time I got out here, the band thing kind of fell through a little bit. But Michael's like, you got to see what I'm doing at LucasArts, and the Lucasfilm Games, actually, still was called. I'm making an interactive music system, and you got to see what that's all about. And so I came into his office and I saw like little pixelated LeChuck walking around on the screen, and heard the LeChuck theme, and I was like, wow, that's really cool. That's really cool. And it was more like, in those days, it was very humble. I mean, we're talking about a PCAT. No one even knows what those are anymore. Playing in graphics mode. Woo. Very humble sound, sort of capabilities. Most of the audience was listening to these games on something called, actually at that point, it was just an ad-lib card. They didn't even have audio, actual digital audio yet, at least not in great numbers. And that quickly was augmented by something called a Sound Blaster, which had a digital component along with this sort of synthesizer component, FM synthesizer component that those cards had. So when you were looking and listening to this stuff, you kind of had to use your imagination about what it was really supposed to sound like. It was a suggestion, really, just like the visuals were a suggestion of what's going on. So was the sound. So it was very, very primitive and early and new, but you could see where it was headed, and sometimes I say, well, if you told us in those days that someday we'd be, writing music for 70-piece orchestra and that would be in a game and everything, we never would have believed you. Fact is, actually, we would have believed you, because you could see, especially if you're, with Lucasfilm Games, with Skywalker Ranch being down the road and everything like that, and you can kind of see what the goal is, what the sort of model is for what you're trying to do. It doesn't take that much imagination to say, well, a few years from now, this technology is going to be so much better that, it's going to be pretty exciting. So we sort of dove into this, being musicians with technical expertise of some sort. The lexicon thing was really important for Michael and me regarding the developing what was called the iMuse system, and that really informed kind of how we did the coding structure, which maybe I can get into at some point. That's sort of a geeky thing.
You will get into this because I want all of the geeky details. Right. But before we get to LucasArts,
it basically was really great we were like, oh my goodness, we actually get paid to come up with something new and write music for it, which was just like, I mean, a job for a musician, an actual job, a working job where you like drive and get something that resembles a real salary. And notice I say something that resembles, and you have this wonderful working environment. It was really an exciting time to do stuff, even if the actual sort of, the actual material hardware was pretty humble. So that's how we started, I would say.
Before LucasArts, as a kid, was there always music around the house?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, when I was living in my earliest memories of Switzerland, are they kind of center around my dad's Sony reel-to-reel tape player, and this is how we listened to music. We did not have any We didn't have a radio in the apartment. We lived in a graduate student apartment in Basel, not too far from the university. This reel-to-reel player, it turned out to be something like really important in my life. But at that time, what it was the sole sort of source of music that wasn't, say, church. Dad had had a pretty small collection of tapes, but they were high quality. One was a lot of Mozart, and the other was an American band called Sons of the Pioneers. And that was a Roy Rogers group in the 30s through the 50s. And amazing singers. It's the classic cowboy tunes, Streets of Laredo and Room Full of Roses and Do Not Forsake Me, Oh My Darlings, songs like that. And it was very, like, for me especially, so I'm like 3 years old and 3.5, 4 years old, and I'm bilingual. I'm speaking Schweizerdeutsch most of the time. But I have this feeling that we're just here, we're visiting, and I'm really an American. Because listen to this cowboy music, man, this is awesome. So I really had these two sides. I had the Mozart side and the Sons of the Pioneers side, and that's stuck with me all the way, through all the way to Hearthstone, all the way to from through my whole sort of career of doing music. I've always had a classical side and a sort of rock and roll or folk or maybe however you want to characterize different types of really it's all folk music to me, rock and roll and jazz. Jazz is its own thing, but it's rooted in jazz is interesting because it's rooted in both too. So that's, and that tape machine that I mentioned, later on, it was, when we moved to the States and stuff and got a record player and I was always listening to music, and I learned to play violin. And in 1973, there was there was a movie called Deliverance that came out. It was about, based on a novel by James Dickey about guys who go into the wilderness in Alabama, Georgia, I think it is, and encounter some very difficult situations. And it had banjo music in it, which was just the banjo suddenly became a huge hit. And my grandfather gave me a banjo that his great uncle Kenneth gave him. It was his uncle Kenneth, my great uncle, whatever.
Was it this banjo?
Yes, that's the banjo. That's a picture. Where'd you get that? That's me in freshman year in college.
I have my sources.
Okay, well, yep, yeah, with a little more hair and a little worse couch than I have now, and yes, that's great Uncle Kenneth's 5-string banjo that I taught myself to play on, and the reason that I mentioned that is the tape recorder was a huge part of that, because Dad's tape recorder, his Sony reel-to-reel, had a 1 3/4 Ips, and 3 3/4 is well, I guess whatever 1 and whatever mini eighths, and 3 3/4 Ips speeds. So what I did was I played the entire Deliverance album out of our stereo system, recorded it onto my dad's machine that that had been so inspiring when I was a little guy, at 3 3/4 Ips, and then played it back at half speed and learned the entire Deliverance album by transcribing the notes from slowed down. When a banjo, by the way, a 5-string banjo sounds remarkably like a piano when you slow it down to half speed. It's kind of weird, but anyways, that's how I learned to play banjo. And it also it's, you know, it was my first foray maybe into studio work or electronic music or whatever you want to call it. But that was a huge sort of musical moment for me as, you know, 13-year-old kid in Kansas. And that sort of interest in folk music carried through college and beyond.
So what was your first paid job as a musician?
First big job as a musician was definitely the job at LucasArts.
First paid job as a musician?
First paid job?
Yeah.
Probably that too. I'm trying to think. Yeah, you know, I mean, yeah, I suppose, you know, you got, you know, what amounts to tip money when you're playing rock and roll in clubs in Boston. So it's probably one of those, you know, that.
Maybe you got a lot of tips.
Yeah. Oh, actually, no, I will tell you what my first paid job as a musician was. It was when I had my sort of crisis of, am I going to be a physicist or not? And I took leave from school for a while. I would play music. I would sing music in the subways of Boston. There's a big Boston street performer tradition. You go get a license and everything, and you get a little bitty amp, and you can play in the corner. This is just about the time, by the way, that Tracy Chapman was doing the same thing, although we never crossed paths. One of her drummers played in one of my bands for a couple gigs. But
wow.
But anyway, that was that time. That was and I did a lot of. I had a cousin who sang, and we sang together. She had a beautiful voice, and we used to sing, you know, duets in the subways, and I also sang solos in the subways. But that's some of my most memorable performances, I think, are subway performances. Because I remember there was one where I sang some Paul Simon songs, and there was this woman was staying there, and the trains kept stopping and going, and she never got on a train. She just sat there and listened. And then after I was done, because it's hard work, you get your voice gets tired. And she said, "Oh, you know, thank you for that. That was just so, you know, that really made my day." She got on the train and left. I thought, wow, you know, music's really great, isn't it?
Did she tip you?
Oh yeah. No, we had, you know, you could get enough. You could make like in a couple hours or something. You could make like $30, which was a fair amount of money in 1980 or so. And it was certainly enough to get you hamburgers and a beer for two musicians.
And it's tax free.
And it's tax free. But so yeah, I guess that would be my first paying gig was singing in the subways.
Okay. And when did you start working at LucasArts exactly? Because, you know, at the time they.
Yeah, 1991. In 91. I was still. I had moved out here, and I was still consulting for Lexicon. I was doing some a rev of some software that Michael actually worked on before I had, and for something called the MRC. It's a remote controller device, and that kind of crossfaded with the work at LucasArts, where we started working on the iMuse system sometime in 91.
So at the time they made the switch between Lucasfilm Games and LucasArts, when you were hired, was it still Lucasfilm Games?
It was still Lucasfilm Games, yeah. Tim Schafer, I think, had joined the company like a couple weeks before I did, if I remember right. Maybe a month or two.
And what was the interview process at LucasArts like?
Oh, the interview process. Well, you know, I had an in because I knew a guy there, right? So it was kind of, there was a little bit of nepotism, you might say. I had a resume that was typed on my Pica typewriter that got me through college that I still haven't, and still, it's just a fully manual typewriter from the 50s, an old Royal that my dad gave me. And I still write lyrics on it because it doesn't make any sound when you're sitting in front of it. So I had a resume that was very carefully typed out on that, and also I made a demo tape of a surfer tune where I recorded all the parts, I multi-tracked all the parts. I had a little multi-track setup, and I made a surfer tune as part of it. So here's my resume. I worked for Lexicon. I've got a music degree. And here's this surfer music. That surfer tune became the Bone Wagon music in Grim Fandango a few years later.
Well played, literally.
Thanks.
And what was your first day at LucasArts like?
Honestly, don't really remember, but it was, the LucasArts was, it was a very young group. I was, I guess if it was 91, I was 31. So I was a little older than some of the people there. Most of the people were in their 20s. So there were a lot of people. It was kind of like college. It was very, very informal and fun. And there was like an honors system for treats. You walk into the kitchen and you could get a Twix bar and then put a little 1 by your name. Oh, I just had a Twix bar. And then at the end of the month, it came out of your salary or whatever. Needless to say, that system didn't last super long. That was the honors system for treats was a you might say was a little emblem of the golden age, and kind of maybe signified how things like the so-called golden age can't last forever.
Wait, so Lucasfilm didn't have any money for snacks? They had to take it out of your paycheck?
Yeah, you had to. Well, I mean, if they were free, yeah, that's right. Yeah, and that's that was long before the years of like if you go to Meta now or a big game company, they've got they've got all that kind of stuff handy because they know it fuels the 70-hour week, right? But no, in those days you had to cough it up for the Twix bars.
Wow.
Folks.
And what was the first project you worked on at LucasArts?
First project I worked on was Monkey 2. And it was kind of a half and half between Monkey 2 and what do you call it?
Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis.
And Fate of Atlantis got very long involved, and so we actually had to step off it for a while, finish Monkey, and then get back onto it. That's the way I remember it anyway. Got to remember, this is like 35 years ago, so I may not be exactly right on all this stuff, but yeah, certainly Monkey shipped before Indy, and we were working on both at the time, and they were both sort of fledgling titles for our interactive music system.
So in 1991, you were credited for original music as well as for the iMuse system on Monkey Island 2: LeChuck's Revenge. Can you talk about some of the technical problems you faced while creating iMuse and how you solved them?
The technical problems The technical problems were a little less difficult than the political ones, and I'll get to that in a second. The technical problems were pretty straightforward because based on the boxes that I had worked on at Lexicon, the reverb, the effects units, were structured with a sort of a main controlling processor that handled the user interface, and then DSP chips, and then another processor that basically was subservient to the controlling processor, but also controlled what was going on in the DSP chips. So you had the sort of the main code and the main processor and the secondary processor, and the main processor, it's sort of the secondary processor was sort of fielding these, the user input from the main processor, and then translating it to what should happen in the DSP process. And the DSP process is interrupt driven, for those of you who are computer folks out there. And the entire set of DSP code runs every sample cycle. Samples being, for some of those boxes, it would be about 32K. These days, of course, it's like whatever, 48K, 96K. But I believe it was a slightly lower sample rate for those units. In any case, every sample cycle, right? Sample being you're breaking up the audio, you're sampling a level every 32,000 times or whatever it would be a second. Every sample cycle, an entire cycle of code runs that does mathematical operations on the samples that have been put into memory by the machine. And this turned out to be a really good metaphor for the way a game system works, because you have the host code, which handles the user interface with the player, and then you have interrupt-driven code that actually makes everything go on the screen and go out the speakers. And then in the middle, you have this sort of you have code that sort of you might say mediates between those two worlds, right? And the iMuse system was basically that second. I'm sorry, the iMuse system was basically that sort of secondary type of code that took the host, what was going on in the host, and said, well, here's where the music is. I am going to set things up so that the music changes in such and such a way at such and such a time, according to what the music thinks should happen. It's kind of a like I say, a mediator between the host and the actual audio going out the speakers. And we had a system of setting flags, right? So that the audio system is playing a MIDI file, if you know what a MIDI file is. So I guess this whole discussion is for people who know what a MIDI file is.
Exactly.
It's playing. So you're playing a MIDI file, and you have special markers in the MIDI file. Sort of to back up for a second, the question is, what were the technical challenges? So let me just answer that in a little bit more 30,000 foot view way of saying it. The technical challenges are to change, to make the music change in response to gameplay in a way that's musically satisfying. So we had, while we were working on this system, a game called Wing Commander came out, which got a lot of notice because the music would change instantly whenever some action would change in the game. And it's very, very effective and very popular. And we're like, wow, that's really cool. But what they weren't doing is if the game changed, the music would immediately change, no matter whether you're halfway through a measure or halfway through a beat or halfway through a note. Boom, you go someplace else. So musically, emotionally, it was very satisfying. Musically, it wasn't quite there. It wasn't like what we wanted to do was have something that's more like a pit orchestra in a live show, in a musical, right? Where if the singer takes a breath or does something a little bit different on stage, the conductor can watch the singer and cue the orchestra to move with the singer. Maybe it's maybe we're going to wrap this little section of the music up sooner than we thought because the curtain call is shorter than we thought it was going to be, and boom, we're going to go to the next section. the conductor says, all right, bar 32, this, after this rep. That's not exactly what they say, but they have ways of signaling because I played in a pit orchestra in high school. I suppose that was a useful background to have had. The conductor can basically say, signal, okay, this is the last repetition. We're going to play this vamp, boom, 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 and now people are coming out on stage. This is the last repetition. We go on to the next part of the music. Well, we wanted to be able to do something like that technologically. Does that make sense?
It does. And what specific techniques does iMuse utilize to smoothly transition between the different musical tracks in real time?
So when I first joined the project, Michael had something called a jump flag, which was really the absolute essence of the concept, which is that you put markers in the music file, in the MIDI file, that say, from this point, it is okay to jump somewhere. And the marker might also say where it's okay to jump to. And when you set a flag that matches that marker, boom, the system executes at the marker, which has been placed by the composer in a musically appropriate spot. It then executes a jump to it plays a new section of music based on that. So it's essentially like railroad switches in the music. That's one sort of, you can turn the switch and then the music will go to another place, and the train won't jump off the track before the turn in the track. It turns at the point where it's supposed to turn. So that was really the essence of the system. Now, when we worked on it together, we also had we expanded that notion to be not just a flag, but something called a hook, and the hooks are something that came from the lexicon code. Whereas you might have different places that have the flags are different numbers, right? So you have a switch that's a number 1 switch, a switch that's a number 2 switch, and depending on what's happening in the game, the system will say, well, the iMuse system will say, okay, well, let's set the numbers. This is happening. Let's set the number 1 switch. The number 1 switch is going to take you to a different place than the number 2 switch is. That makes sense?
Mm-hmm.
So it's not just a flag. It's actually a little hook that says you can. It's a little decision maker that is conditional on a variety of different conditions rather than just go somewhere or don't go somewhere. It's go here depending on what's happening. And needless to say, there's a fair amount of work to code that all up. I went before I get into the political thing. There's also what's playing at the current moment. So there's 2 things: is when you're playing music, where are you in the file? And given where you are in the file, how many parts are you playing? Because MIDI files have channels, so you can determine which things to play and which things not to play at a moment. Also by using hooks. So, for example, you might have a tune that has a clarinet solo in it, and you don't want to hear the clarinet solo every time. You want to hear it under certain circumstances. Well, you can set a hook that says "turn on the clarinet solo." And those, as a sort of a technical point for people who are really into this stuff, all those messages that I just described are handled through MIDI system exclusive messages. So we had custom MIDI messages that we would put into the files, and we developed the whole system for doing that. It was quite a lot of work. the actual technical way to solve this problem, I never felt like it was that hard. I felt like it was just what needed to happen. But when we were done with our first pass, it came to people's attention that the new sound drivers that we had come up with were taking an entire floppy disk of code, which was really, really, that was really, really not okay, because the number of floppy disks, everything's shipped on floppy disks still. CDs not come out yet, at least not for games. The adding a floppy disk or taking up a whole floppy disk is like, that's like, if it's 7 disks or 5 disks, that's a seventh or a fifth of the cost of goods, right, to ship. It's not a small deal. And so we were like, and I told Michael this, everybody's pissed at us because the new sound drivers are taking up an entire floppy disk. Well, we better have a name for this thing, because without a name, we're hosed, and we got to stop calling it a driver. It's a system. So we went out to dinner and came up with the name iMuse, the iMuse system. Everybody was talking about the iMuse system. Then we could draw things on a whiteboard, and you could see a big box that said iMuse system. And then suddenly, when you see the word system and it's got an acronym, it just doesn't feel as bad to people that's taking up an entire floppy disk now. So that was and that was a reasonable objection, I have to say. Like I said, it's no small deal to take up that much code when code is at such a premium.
Well, you could have charged extra, just like they did with the Loom Roland MT32 patch, which you had to pay extra to get.
Yeah, that's well, the economics of all that didn't really last all that long. I think it's fair to say. We were given the story goes, we were given a mandate by George Lucas to I don't care what you do, just make cool stuff, and we really ran with that mandate until one day it was not feasible anymore.
Now, I presume that composing a score is difficult enough without having to handle a variety of hooks and musical cues that can intertwine with the main melody based on the player's action in the game. Mm-hmm. What was your process for understanding how all of these melodies and hooks would come together in the final game?
Just something you kept in your head. It wasn't really that... conceptually, it wasn't hard at all. It was in the beginning. It took two people. It took the composer sitting next to the coder to actually implement all the scripting at the host level. We're talking at the host level here. Like, well, Guybrush, just opened the bottle. Now set this hook. Every single one of those little moments, the composer knew what to do, so the composer needed to tell the coder, and that was an unacceptable. That was just it. We did that on Indie, and we did it on Monkey, and probably a little bit on Sam and Max too. But we very quickly went to a new system where the game system, the host was simply sending game states saying, Guybrush just opened the bottle, for example, to the music system, which was then responsible for translating that into useful information. And that way of doing things we did on Grim Fandango. We may have done something like that on Full Throttle too. I can't remember. Full Throttle was digital audio though, so it was a little bit. There was less sort of iMuse in Full Throttle.
Now, as a composer, you ensure your score fits the scene by watching it and determining if it works. But with this type of dynamic soundtrack, did you personally test out the various hooks by playing the game over and over again?
Oh yeah. Yeah, we tested everything. And we actually had a little utility where we could just make sure that the hooks worked right. So just in our studio and in our offices. So there was a tradition to name utilities like that after bodily fluids. That's where the scum interface came from, and there was sputum, and there was all sorts of stuff like that in bile, right? And the utility that we inherited was called earwax, and I wrote something called Q-tip to replace earwax. Q-tip is it's actually kind of a double pun, I suppose, because you're cleaning out the earwax, and also there's musical cues, right? So, but that was just a PC based little utility where you could set a hook and then listen to how the musical file responded to it using the iMuse system and make sure that it did what you expected it to do.
Now, you are humble enough to say that you guys came up with the name iMuse, but Michael Land said that you have a knack for naming things and that you are the one who came up with the name iMuse. So how did you come up with a name that would eventually be used to describe Apple's entire lineup of products?
Okay, so we came up with iMac before they did. That was really funny, and that was I think iMac was anyway. But regarding the name iMuse, my memory of it is, and I hope that everything I've said so far jives with what Michael said about how we came up with stuff. That's the way I remember it. I could be wrong. My memory of it is that, so we went to Chevy's, this Mexican restaurant at the Hilltop Mall in East Bay, and we thrashed on this thing for the entire dinner and couldn't come up with anything. And one of us said Muse.
I'm giving you a chance to take all of the credit.
Yeah. So anyway, it was I did kind of name it, but there were tweaks that we did together, and the little I, I think changing the I to a little I think I said Muse, and then Michael said, no, let's make sure that it's not just, let's call it interactive music and sound effects, right? That was what that was supposed to stand for. And I said, okay. And I think I had the idea of, let's make it, because this was just starting to be a thing, let's make it a little I for interactive. And that'll, anyway, that's, I like to name things. Like, I've had a couple lucky names. That might be one of them.
I really hope that the story would go into the direction of, and behind us was Steve Jobs, and then he came.
Yeah, right. No, we totally did the little I thing before they did, and it was little I for interactive. And so I don't know if I have no idea whether we were probably just tapping into the larger sort of Gestalt pop naming Gestalt, vibe, whatever, to do that little I. But anyway.
Now, when I played Monkey Island 2 as a kid, I didn't have a sound card, so I listened to the soundtrack through my PC speaker. How much work did you put into downsampling all of this incredible music that you probably composed on the Roland MT32 to play on a PC speaker?
That was a brutal job. I never personally did that myself. We were just transitioning out of PC speaker when I came aboard. But we did do PC speaker versions for Monkey and probably Indie too. And that is some. What I can tell you is that there are two commands for the PC speaker: speaker in and speaker out. And somehow you can turn those into pitches. But at the end of the day, you're just doing speaker in and speaker out at different rates, obviously, to give you different pitches. I don't know how even you did the rate thing, but Yeah, it was very, very primitive and very difficult to do. And you had to kind of simulate the other voices because you're really only playing one melody at a time with the speaker. I mean, it's pretty hard to play two at the same time.
It has two modes, extra noisy and kind of noisy. And you need to switch between the two.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. Yeah, like I said, I was lucky. I got there late enough not to actually have to do any PC speaker work.
Now, speaking of naming things, could you elaborate on the process and inspiration behind creating Jacob's Ladder sound for the MT32?
Jacob's Ladder sound. Remind me what that is.
It's a customized sound you created for the MT32, and you named it.
I did?
You did.
And I named it Jacob's Ladder?
Yeah.
This is really, this sounds vaguely, so where did it get used? This sounds vaguely familiar, but...
In various games, but back then, you had the sounds that came with the MT32, and you could create custom sounds. Now, I know that Sierra used a lot of custom sounds, but for LucasArts, they didn't use that many. So there were a few of them, one of them created by Michael Land and one of them created by you. And it was called Jacob's Ladder.
And did Michael tell you this?
No, I read it online. I think you talked about it in an interview from 1998 or...
Oh dear. Okay, so it came from an interview with me, and I said this. I really don't recall. I mean, it rings the vaguest bell. But we did come from sort of a like I say, an electronic music background, and that was the MT32 was a wavetable synthesizer where you would have. It's sort of influenced by the Roland D50, which was a very popular synth in the 80s. It would have a sample. It used the concept that much of what your ear perceives in the quality of a sound comes from the attack. So samplers are, of course, recorded sounds. They're like, a sampled piano literally is recorded piano notes that you play back, and you layer them so that you can have different velocities, different ways of hitting the keys, and that triggers different samples. And there's all kinds of fancy stuff that you do with samples. But at the end of the day, samplers, which are basically at the heart of all technology that composers use to mimic live sound these days, are playing back recorded notes. And that is very, very memory intensive and space intensive. I have gigs and gigs and gigs of samples on my system. Not practical for shipping with a game in 1991. But Roland's wavetable technology played on the fact that if you actually record just the attack of, say, a flute sound, and then use a synthesizer tone to play the rest of the note, your ear is reasonably convinced that that's a flute. And so the MT32 was based on that type of technology, where the wavetable, there was a wave for the attack, and then there was a wave for the part that sustains, and you got away with very little storage in order to do that. Of course, it didn't sound exactly like a flute or whatever, but it had a nice quality to it. It had a more complex quality than just, say, a synthesizer, which sounds very much like I don't want to downplay the good synthesizers, because there's nothing like a good old Moog, but they sound like a Moog. It's its own instrument. And when you're sort of exploring sounding like other instruments, wavetable is a very useful technology that allows you to get kind of close to the sound of, say, a French horn without having to record a French horn. And that's, so the Jacob's Ladder, oh boy, yeah, this does ring some kind of a bell. I don't.
And it's a great
remember.
name, so it's right up your alley.
Yeah, so it's probably like a repeating sound that sort of goes or something like that. I'm just going to guess because that's what you know what a Jacob's ladder is in like a mad scientist lab, right? It's that a Jacob's ladder. This also comes from the Bible, as we know, but it's if you watch an old 1950s horror movie and Dr. Frankenstein in his lab, you'll see in the background like a couple of antennae sticking out of some box, and then a little lightning bolt between the two antennae that pops at the top, and it keeps doing that one after the other. Then those are the rungs of the Jacob's ladder. Pop, pop, right. So it's a classic sci-fi kind of 50s gizmo that you would see in old films, and that's what that would have been named after.
I thought you named it after the movie that came out in the early 90s, so it's around the same time. Maybe you like the movie.
Yeah, I doubt it. I think I probably named it out after the mad scientist reference.
Okay.
I don't remember seeing. I remember hearing about that movie. I don't think I saw it.
Okay, it's a great movie. You should see it.
What is it? What's it about?
Well, I can't tell you because
you don't want to
give away the plot. You should watch it without reading anything about it.
Okay. All right, I'll check it out. I love stuff like that.
In Monkey Island 2, do you remember which of the islands in the game you worked on?
I get a little when we were working on Return, I remembered. I think
so there's Cab, Fat, Booty, and Dinky.
I think I worked on Booty. Yeah, I worked on Booty and the water stuff.
Okay.
Yeah. So like the underwater music, which I reprised in Return. I was kind of fond of that one piece that I did for the diving to the sunken boat. So we reprised it in a couple situations in Return to Monkey.
We were all fond of it.
I think it was Booty Island that had stuff that had the more jazzy clarinet solo stuff would be me.
Now, when discussing iMuse in Monkey Island 2, the main showcases of iMuse's capabilities in the game are Woodtick and the Voodoo Lady. Mm-hmm. In the rest of the game, the iMuse transitions appear to be more subtle and less elaborate. Was this a conscious decision?
I think it was a combination of things. I think that the Voodoo Lady and Woodtick really lent themselves to that type of treatment because they had, in Woodtick, you had a whole bunch of places that you could go to very quickly from one another, which I can't think of, at least right now, I can't think of any other place in the game where that was the case. So that really lent itself to making something of the transition and really making sort of those changes of venue more sparkly and fun. And the Voodoo Lady, of course, you go through the swamp to get to her. And that, again, just really lends itself to something that's going to build. So, and those are the two, when I was talking about the two dimensions of the interactivity in the iMuse system, where what I call this for folks out there who are familiar with adaptive music systems now, my lingo is a little different than WY's. I talk about horizontal interactivity. And what I mean is when you're going in one place in the timeline horizontally to another. When I talk about vertical interactivity, I'm talking about what is playing at a given moment. And you have control over what is playing at a given moment. For some reason, these two terms are reversed in the world of WYs and maybe FMOD too. But I don't understand that. That's their gig. They're fantastic systems, by the way. I use both of them. But just lingo wise, I'm still comfortable calling this thing vertical and that thing horizontal. So the having explained what I mean by what I'm saying, wood tick really, really lent itself to horizontal act. We can go to one different place. We can have each place can be related to the main tune musically, but really have its own little version of the tune, its own little or its own little complete orchestration, right, of the tune. Because the characters are so different. It's all about the characters in each room, right? So each character gets his own his own little theme. And so as you're going through wood tick, it makes sense that you would want to just smoothly transition into and out of these themes. And this is something also that we did in Return in some of the town pieces. Now, so that's the horizontal piece. The vertical piece, again, the Voodoo Lady really lends herself to that because you're going through this swamp, and as you get closer to her, there's a certain sense of tension building. So you want to add voices. You want to have a piece playing, but you want to add voices, layers as you get closer and closer to the Voodoo Lady, until once you are with her, you have the whole piece playing. And that's both of those techniques are still used, today. And I would say that second technique is probably the most common technique in anything from like The Last of Us or something like that. It's very common to layer or Plants vs. Zombies Garden Warfare. That's one I scored. Where you build things, where you build layers in order to increase tension.
It makes sense because the Voodoo Lady changes are more immediate, while in wood tick it takes a while for them to transition in or transition out.
And that's true too. When you're changing layers, you can kind of get away with more. And you can do it in less time. So you're playing something. In MIDI, it was completely seamless because you're never going to play the end of a note. You only start playing the next note, if that makes sense. You're not going to bring in a part mid note because that's not the way MIDI works. MIDI only has notes on and notes off. And so if the note on is already played, unless you're going back and looking for it, you're not going to play it when you get to that point in the file. Does that make sense?
So the Voodoo Lady has both methods because while you're in the swamp, the changes are immediate. So it's vertical. But when you reach the skull and you need to go up the elevator, then Guybrush holds off for a couple of seconds for the music to align, and then it's got the musical cue of going up the elevator.
Yeah. That's both. Yeah.
Okay.
That was a ton of work, to do those things, and again, we got in a little bit of trouble, really, honestly, for how much of a load we put on the production timeline to do all that. So,
well, it was worth it. I noticed it back then. So,
but it did encourage us to streamline the system later, so that we didn't have to involve so many people.
Now, I know that you voiced several characters throughout your career, but I don't think that many people know that you also voiced Largo in the original non-talkie version of Monkey Island 2. Is that correct?
No, that's Clint.
No, that's you.
Pretty sure that was Clint.
Okay, let me share my screen.
Because he said a couple of things that he slipped in a couple almost cuss words, and I remember that because it went through a little, when you poke Largo with the pin, that was our first little foray. Ooh, yeah. Okay.
Listen to what Clint has to say.
Okay.
And for Largo, when you poked his voodoo doll, I think, if I remember correctly, with a needle, and he exclaimed a little painful, "Arr!" like this, that was Peter McConnell going, "Arr!" And that's about as much audio as we could afford to ship in that game.
Sorry, I'm sure he's wrong. Because I remember he said, oh gosh, I don't even want to say it. I remember he said a couple of cuss words. And we cut off some of the, they were not all this, not all the consonants. We either chopped off the consonants or didn't say the consonants. But I'm just, if you can play Largo,
yeah, I will play Largo, and then we'll watch your performance.
Then we'll see. We'll see who it was. Yeah, that's Clint.
That's Clint?
And that's Clint.
Oh, man. So he lied?
I'll stand by. I'll see. He's just being kind. Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I suppose we could do some kind of, we could go try to find the audio somewhere, but yeah, I'm pretty sure that's Clint. And it's one of us. But one of the interesting thing about that, that song of the Largo theme, that the part that you just played.
Well, I have a question about it.
Yeah.
So wait with the answer.
Okay, go ahead.
Michael Land told me that the Largo theme was written by both of you, with you composing the A theme and him composing the B theme. How did you create a theme that fits a character so perfectly? And what adjustments did either of you make to seamlessly blend the A and B themes together?
You know, that he's right. That we did write that theme together, and there were. I feel like there might have been a couple other instances in Monkey where we did something slightly similar, because in Monkey and Indie were two projects where we all wrote the music, and so we would, to some degree, toss things back and forth a little bit. Largo was definitely a pure example of like the Lennon-McCartney technique. I mean, Paul, if you've ever read the famous Playboy interview with John Lennon about how they work together, it's really enlightening. And essentially, the way, according to that article, the way they would work is that if one of them would get stuck, they would take the song to the other. And usually what it was it would be Paul who had I can't think of really any Beatles song where it's not a John bridge, but Paul would come up with a melody, and then he'd be like, okay, where do I go from here? And John would always come in with what they called the middle eight bars, also known as the bridge in the song. So an example of that would be, Michelle, my belle, these are words that go together well. My Michelle. I mean, classic McCartney. I mean, such an intricate, perfect melody, right? But then where do you go? And John comes in with, I love you, I love you, I love you. Completely different personality, but it complements the verse absolutely perfectly. You know, and another example is I Want to Hold Your Hand, right? Oh, I tell you something, do, I hope you understand, right? Very, like, again, melodic perfection from Paul, but then the soul comes in with and when I touch you, I feel happy inside. Completely different kind of line, very bluesy. John, when he talked about Michelle, he said he was thinking about Bessie Smith, who's a blues singer. This is all from memory, but I'm pretty sure that was right. So that gives you an idea, right? That their songwriting team was so powerful because there was never a weak moment, because as soon as one thing ended, the guy would come in and give it that thing that it was missing, that place it needed to go. And so in a very, very humble way, the Largo piece was that. And I think I'm not sure it's possible that we might have both written a Largo tune and gone, well, here's my Largo. Hey, I didn't know you were writing a Largo tune. Oh, well, here's mine. Oh, look at this. They fit together really well. It could have been that. It could have been, it might, I feel like it could also possibly have been that Mike actually wrote the bridge first. And I then added the beginning because we felt that the middle it had part of Largo, but it didn't have the complete obnoxiousness of Largo just quite yet. You needed something that was a little more ba-dum, bum, bum, ba-da-da-ba. So that's my part. Yeah, it's, it is kind of like I say, however we actually, whatever order we did things in the back of our mind, we had that Lennon-McCartney sort of method to look to.
Well, you guys were the Beatles of computer games.
I think we actually think of ourselves as the Stooges of computer games. I think Clint might have mentioned that. We had a fourth stooge, by the way, Michael McMahon, who did a great deal of the technical work from 1992 on or so, and we called him Shemp and Clint Curley, and I was Larry, and Mike was definitely Mo.
You weren't the Three Stooges. You guys were the Beatles. Take it or leave it.
Hey, don't sell the Stooges short. They're great.
Not musically.
I still watch them. Oh yeah. Hey, I still watch those with my son. Anyway, I appreciate that. That's very kind of you, actually, to say that, and I think it's maybe a little over the top.
Now, speaking of 1992, you are credited for original music as well as for the IMU system on Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis. Do you remember which locations in the game you were assigned to?
I kind of don't. I know that Clint did the God Machine and the pretty sure he did the jumping over all the molten lava stuff. I'm absolutely positive Clint did the God Machine, because he's really wonderful. This sort of, I don't know, a wall of sound that's got all this intricate stuff going on in it. I know I did the Desert Chase. Man,
it's pretty stressful because you're on the camel and they're coming to attack you. So,
right.
Thanks for giving me a heart attack.
Hal Barr would really like that piece of music. I remember he was complimentary about it. That was inspired by a Jascha Heifetz piece that Jascha Heifetz performed on a. What was the name?
Wait, so let's say you listen to the entire soundtrack. Can you point which musical cues you've created and which were done by Michael or Clint?
Maybe. I mean, if you were to play them, maybe I could. I know that I've listened to a couple and not known actually who it was, because it's tough, because you have these samples. It's two things. One is samples are playing, and so there's a sort of vanilla quality where everything sounds like everything else when it's played on the synthesizer. And then there's also the fact that as much as possible, we're using John Williams themes. So we're taking a backseat to him as much as we can. So we're all trying to kind of imitate him. And to, like Clint's version of Williams versus mine versus Michael's are like, I mean, they would be really distinguishable, I think, with live musicians, but it's kind of hard to tell. And so that said, if you have something to play for me, I might be able to guess.
No, we're not gonna listen to the entire soundtrack as much as I want to.
Yeah.
You guys should have been like hip hop artists nowadays when they say, the name of the producer at the beginning of the song. So in each of the tracks, you should have added, a sample of Peter McConnell on the mic or Peter McConnell on the keyboard.
Yeah, well, yeah. That was before the days of OSTs too. The first OST I think we did was for Sam and Max, and it was because we had space on a little space left over on one of the CDs. So we did a lot. We did a sort of a sampled version of Doug the Mole Man on that.
I remember.
Which that's one of the few pieces I wrote for Sam and Max.
On Rebel Assault, which was released in 1993, you're credited for sound advice. Now, apart from being a great play on words, what kind of sound advice did you provide about sound?
Well, so Vince Lee, who was an absolute wunderkind, he was a real programming genius. He and a very like roll up your sleeves kind of programmer. Like he was like, okay, well, I don't see any reason why we can't actually have John Williams music in a Star Wars game. And there was a lot of I think skepticism maybe about that. And I think people thought that we in the sound department might be somehow, us iMuse guys might be somehow threatened that Vince had come up with this different way of doing sound in a game. And far from it, when we first heard what he was doing, Asai was doing with something called Insane, which was his video interleaving and audio interleaving sound. We were like, oh man, no, this is the future. This is where it's happening. And I don't care if it's like 8-bit and 11K, and mono, which I think of all three of those things it was really, really very rudimentary sonically, but conceptually, it was like, okay, this is where it's all headed. And so I think I don't remember. I remember that we talked a lot with Vince, but I don't know that I gave him any sort of insight that he didn't already have. His most important insight, I think, which a lot of I wish certain companies like Avid, who makes Pro Tools, understood, was that it's actually sound that comes first, not video. Because if you see a video glitch, it's annoying. If you hear a sound glitch, it's a deal killer.
I agree.
And he understood that, and so he made his entire video system actually lock to the sound. This is the way I remember it anyway, and that's why Rebel Assault worked so well, and why it had so few glitches, is that it put the sound first. Says the sound guy, right? But this is just true stuff. If you see a little blip on the screen, it is annoying and it's noticeable. But if you hear a glitch in the sound, it's triggering something that is basically your ancestors when they came out of the trees, in Africa and had to run away from a lion. It's triggering anything that goes wrong with sound. It hits you on a much more fundamental survival level. So you want the sound to never mess up as much as you possibly can.
I agree. Same goes with podcasts. When you look at the differences between the webcams, exactly. You don't have a problem that one guest or one of the hosts has a lower quality webcam, but you will have a problem if the mic is a basic mic or that there is no noise cancellation or volume differences. Volume differences is a deal breaker. Now, I usually listen to all of my guests' previous interviews, and a lot of the times when I'm listening to a podcast in which the volume of the host is much higher than the volume of the guest or the other way around, then I just read the transcript of the video on YouTube instead of listening to it.
Oh gosh, yeah. That's yeah. Wow. Yeah, I mean, and like if I were to suddenly be over here, right, because of some sort of camera glitch, it would be like, oh yeah, there was a camera glitch. But if you hear a big loud tick or a pop or even a drop in my voice, it's going to be like, oh, that's not cool, That's anyway, but yeah. So that was. So I don't know. I don't remember what advice. There was some, but Vince was. He was a real monster when it came to. He was just such a talented programmer and forward thinking guy. That I think I seem to recall Michael and I both, talk to him about different things and maybe we talked about audio branching or something. I would guess it might have been something like that.
Michael also got the sound advice credit.
Yeah, that makes sense. That I feel like we both talked to Vince about what he was doing, but he didn't need a lot of help.
Okay. Still in 1993, you weren't credited as the voice of Yoda in Super Star Wars: The Empire Strikes Back. Let's listen to your amazing performance.
Oh, dear.
That is why you fail. That is why you fail.
That wasn't a bad one, was it?
That is why you fail.
Fail, yes.
And this would play whenever it was game over, whenever you would actually fail. So you taunted us as players.
Yeah. You say I was not credited?
Nope.
Okay, yeah. That's probably, I don't know why that necessarily would have been, maybe they were just too embarrassed to say that the sound guys were doing that. I remember in those days, some games, it was clearly like programmer art or programmer music, but the worst by far was when there was programmer voice acting. And so it might have been that they just didn't want to admit that someone who wasn't a voice actor was. And we were kind of going through the voice department because now that I think of it, that was in Rebel Assault, was it? That is why you fail.
No, that was in Super Star Wars: The Empire Strikes Back.
Oh,
it was for the Super Nintendo.
Yeah, that's right, for the SNES. That's still about the same time, if I remember, though, and the voice department was still kind of being built, and the whole idea that you would hire an actor to work in the game. I don't know if LucasArts did it first, but I wouldn't be surprised if they did it first. It was, now it's like completely, required, and no one doesn't hire a proper actor to do a game. But in those days, there was still, like I said, that it was pretty much the Wild West. So that might have been one reason. But yes, I did that. I remember.
Well played. You got like 2 lines in the entire game. How many takes did it require you to record this line?
Not too many. It wasn't that hard. I did Admiral Akbar too.
I know. We'll get to that.
I did Yoda and Admiral Akbar, and I died a lot.
Still in 1993, you were credited for music on Sam & Max See the Road. Now, the interesting thing about this particular game, on which you collaborated again with Michael Land and Clint Bajekian, is that unlike all of the previous games you worked on together, this one didn't have 3 separate plots to divide the work among you guys. So Monkey Island
Right.
2 had 3 separate islands, Indiana Jones had
Yep.
3 separate paths, and Day of the Tentacle had 3 separate timelines. So in this game, given that there was no such division, how did you decide who would work on what?
I think it was just kind of by inclination. It was Sam and Max was largely Clint's, and I did do the theme, and I did. Now I can't remember who did the music. I did Doug the Mole Man and the fishing music, which is based on a traditional song, and there was probably some so the Stuckies music. I might have done the Stuckies music because Snuckies they call it in the game, but I had many road trips with my family when I was young, going from Kansas to Connecticut, where the family cabins were, and stopping at Stuckies was always a highlight. So I enjoyed that aspect of the game. What I can't remember is whether I actually did the because Clint's quite a master of music as well. We both like that sort of cheesy stuff. And then maybe the weird world that has all the strange perspective. But I really do think that Clint did the bulk of that music. I think it was more like I did what we felt worked for me to do, and I probably had technical stuff I was supposed to be working on at the time too. So that and Clint was just 100% on Sam and Max.
Okay. Still in 1993, a demo of The Dig was featured on a British TV show called Bad Influence. Now, the score for the demo was not created by Michael Land or Clint Pachakian. Could you shed some light on where this score is from?
Finally, here's a sneak preview of the Ultimate Movie tie-in. These are early development pictures of The Dig, a game based on an idea by movie director Steven Spielberg. It's an adventure set up in deep space, which will eventually include some pioneering new graphics techniques and an amazing array of colors. But don't hold your breath waiting for the release of The Dig on the big screen. It proved too expensive for a film budget, so Spielberg just ditched the movie and went right along.
Do you know the score?
Boy, that sounds almost like John Williams. Which I suppose they probably could have gotten permission for. It's really hard to tell with the resolution there, but that's not Wagner. So the Michael and the actual score in the game, we had rights to. We secured rights to a performance of instrumental performance from the Ring cycle of Wagner's Ring, and it was. I mean, to be honest, it wasn't the best performance, but it was an orchestral rendition that Michael then painstakingly chopped up into just textures and single chord, mostly single chord textures. And it actually kind of reflects a little bit. I don't know if he mentioned this, but it reminded me anyway of a project that he did when he was in our electronic music class in college. But just the technique that he used. But in any case, it was these Wagnerian chords that he, it just, was a huge labor to get them all chopped up and then make pieces out of them, these textural things that would move from one harmony to the other, and very effective for the game. It's very, very sci-fi sounding. And so, sort of on that line between the organic orchestra sound and then just kind of the sampled synth sound, just because of the way it was treated.
And during your time at LucasArts, did you get to see, play, or experience any of the previous iterations of The Dig by Noah Falstein or Brian Moriarty?
I don't remember. Yeah, I didn't know that. I had forgotten that Brian and Noah worked on it before Sean did. Yeah, I really don't remember. I do remember that Steven was a avid game player, and we would actually we got, I think Michael got a letter from Steven Spielberg about, maybe it was the Monkey Island games, just, congratulating him on what a nice score it was. And the story that we were told was he had his own rig, Steven did, to play games. And, the best PC you could get at the time, with the best screen you could get at the time, with the best little speakers you could get at the time, and in one full-time dude who kept it all running like clockwork, and an MT32, of course, not just but he had the really, he had the tricked out game setup that would have represented, maybe 5% of our audience, if that.
The top 1%.
Yeah, maybe the top 1%, but he was an avid game player and a big appreciator of. It's kind of funny because I almost wonder why he didn't do a game company rather than George, because I think Steven Spielberg, as far as I could tell, was more interested in games than George was. But I guess there's a difference between what kind of statement you like to make and what kind of actual sort of things you like to engage in.
So Sierra was adding support for the Roland MT32 because they were selling them as a bundle. They were selling their games with the Roland MT32. You guys were adding Roland MT32 support so that Steven Spielberg could listen to the games at the highest quality, right?
Pretty much. Well, it wasn't just for him, but it was. We were, rock and roll musicians from the 80s, and we really liked the sound of the MT32 because it was kind of D50ish, and it just had a deeper, rich kind of palette. In some ways, it was kind of nicer sending the sound canvas, to be honest with you, which is more sample based. The MT32 just had this. It has a sound that's kind of fat and rich and satisfying. So no, I don't know that we were doing that in response to specifically Steven Spielberg, but we knew that he had one. That's my memory of it anyway.
Okay. Still in 1995, you got quite a few credits on Full Throttle, and we're going to discuss each and every one of them. Let's start with the most important one, the special biker haiku section. Do you remember your haiku?
Splitting lanes at Rush. Beamer tries for a cutoff. Taste my righteous chain.
Wow, well played.
I'll tell you something. Keith Karloff, who is who's the leader of the Gone Jackals, is the absolute real deal when it comes to rock and roll, and I have nothing but respect for the guy. And it was I think a bit of a challenge for both of us to negotiate the relationship between a real rock and roll and the semi-corporate world of LucasArts. And one, just there was all this hassle in getting the contract signed because he's used to getting screwed by the record industry, and there's a certain amount of miscommunication that happened during the contract process, and he was also a bouncer at, he was the night manager at the Up and Down Club in San Francisco, which was a really cool. It was an acid jazz club. This is all this kind of interesting music was happening at that time. The acid jazz kind of ties into the swing revival that happened just after that, which influenced Graham Fandango, right? And Keith managed the Up and Down Club, which was, as I said, it was really one of the tippy top acid jazz clubs in San Francisco, and all this kind of stuff. So there's that world, right? And then there's the world of Full Throttle, and I really hope, I think Keith will be okay with my saying this. He came to look at the game. First of all, how did I find Keith? How did I find the Gone Jackals? That's probably one of the things you want to know.
Yeah, because you have a credit for Jackal Wrangler.
Yeah, and that was basically, I actually found the band, or they found me, and somehow or other. See, I had a band of my own at the time. It was sort of a post-punk sort of pop band, so somehow or other, and I honestly don't remember how I did it, but I made it known in the sort of local scene. Hey, we're looking for a biker band. We want a good biker band. And this is after, and I'll get back to Keith in a second, but it's worth saying how the whole Music for Full Throttle evolved, because the Music for Full Throttle became exactly what it needed to be. And it was very, it went through quite a journey. The first thing was that Jack Sorensen, who was president, or actually his business affairs manager during Full Throttle, he got a deal with whatever record company, Verve or whoever it is, that to license the entire Velvet's catalog. Now, if you're a rock and roll fan, you know that there's pretty much nobody cooler than the Velvet Underground. I mean, they are one of the coolest bands ever. Brian Eno said about their first record, well, maybe only 2,000 people bought it, but every one of those people went out and started a band, right? So like, oh my God, we have the Velvets, right? And I listened to their entire catalog, and we played it with, scenes of Ben getting on his bike, riding down the road. And it was just like, this is some of the best rock and roll ever, but it's not the right rock and roll for this game. It's just not. However, Tim had he had some Soundgarden kicking around. So he put a recording of Kickstand under those same scenes, right? Well, Soundgarden, great band from that era. Not the same sort of legendary status as the Velvets, but very much a big band at the time, and excellent musicians and so on. And is like, well, that kind of works. Look at that. It's got this girth. It's it's got that heavy grunge thing going on. And so Tim and Jack, business affairs manager, went down to A&M Records. Now, I'm going to tell a story here. If it ain't true, it ought to be. I was not present at this meeting, but the story that was told to me was they show up at A&M Records. A&M had they had Soundgarden. The Soundgarden was on their roster, so they were there to talk about that. And so they show up at A&M Records, and this is, again, record companies then were very different than they are now. They were extremely powerful still, and so it was a big deal for to go down to LA and meet with basically really high up people in the company. And so they show up, and the sort of officious young assistants show up, and they write this way. Mr. M will be with you any moment. They go to a nice big conference room, and everybody sits down, and Mr. M isn't there yet. It's kind of a little bit of a wait, and then Mr. M shows up, and he sits down. He says, and turns to the officious young assistant next to him, and he says, well, suppose you tell me what this is all about. And these gentlemen are here from LucasArts, George Lucas's game company. And they're here to see if maybe one of our marquee band. And then I already know that. I just wanted to hear it from you to see if you thought it through. So, needless to say, this meeting did not go well. and so Tim and Jack left empty-handed. And it was then left to me. It was put in my lap. Okay, find a band. We struck out with the big leagues. Coolest band in the history of ever, just doesn't work for the game. A really appropriate mega star right now. We just can't wing. They don't understand the economics of this thing. Oh, they don't understand that. Yes, it's LucasArts, but LucasArts only sells this many games, not like you sell this many records, right? And so I let it be known. So I really can't remember how I did this, but word in the grapevine: LucasArts looking for biker bands. And man, like the next week, like piles of cassettes start showing up in my office. This is the day of cassette players, right? And so I would drive to my band rehearsal. A couple times a week, maybe 3 times a week. We rehearsed a lot, actually, for non-pros. And on the way, I'd pop a cassette in. And what I found with demo tapes, having been on both ends of the demo world, is if you don't hear something, this is going to sound really harsh, but I'm a composer. I pitch all the time. I get rejected. I know it's like to be on the demoing end, but I also know it's like to be on the listening end, on the guy who's being demoed to's end, right? And what I found is if you press play, and in the first 5 seconds, and I mean 1001, 1002, 1003, 1004, 1005, if you don't hear what you want to hear, toss it out. It's not worth it. Because I tried so many I tried so many where I listened to longer than that, having decided that I didn't like the first 5 seconds. I was like, oh, geez, this is even worse than I thought. So, I was getting pretty ruthless as I was listening to these demo tapes. No, oh yeah, another Lynyrd Skynyrd clone. No, thank you. I love Lynyrd Skynyrd, but no. And on and on, and then I popped this one tape in, and it's like, or actually, I'm like, who are these guys? This is righteous. And by the way, it didn't hurt that Keith delivered the demo tape in person on a bike, but I actually scrambled it up so I wouldn't know who it was. I listened to the tapes blind, so I knew that I already knew who Keith was. I already knew that he delivered the demo tape on a bike. But I was being very sort of neutral about how I listened to the cassettes, and this one just popped out above the others, and that's how the Gone Jackals got selected. They're like, wow, this is the game. This is the music that should be. Now, getting back to the haiku, right? So Keith came to visit as part of our whole process. We had to do music-only versions of his songs. We mixed those over to a place called Poolside in San Francisco, which is a legendary studio. And they're still operating. Dave Nelson, for all you studio buffs out there. So there's a lot of working together on how the music fits in the game. And at one point, Keith said, I got a question for you. This ain't a violent game, is it? And I was like, well, okay. Because I got kids, And I said, well, honestly, Keith, I mean, you okay, so there are these scenes where you're driving along a bike and there's other bikers and you got to whack them with a chain. Okay. Yeah, you got to do that. And he was like, oh, okay, well, I've done that. And I know he was just kidding, but I know he was just kidding, but it stuck in my mind. And that's where the haiku came from.
So we talked about the second credit, which was the Jackal Wrangler, and about the fourth credit, which is composer and music producer. So let's talk about the third credit.
By the way, I just have to say that, honestly, Full Throttle would not be Full Throttle without the Gone Jackals. They're just, it really, we were so lucky to have a band that really plays real rock and roll, has their own sound, doesn't answer to anybody. His lyrics today, I think they're even more poignant now than they were then. If you actually read the lyrics, especially Legacy. And I just can't say enough about just how lucky we were to have that music in the game and to be able to sort of, mix it in with also I did background music as well for the game. Anyway, go ahead. Sorry.
Well, we've already established that sound is 90% of the experience. Now, the third credit is for additional programming, which I assume is related to the upgrade required for iMuse to support digital audio instead of MIDI. What can you tell me about this upgrade?
I have an
additional programming. Yeah. Well, this is the
I don't know that it was specifically I don't remember that I worked on the audio implementation per se. That additional programming is probably actually just implementing it in the game. To be like real honest about my sort of engineering abilities. I mean, yes, I'm on a couple of U.S. patents, and I'm a pretty good designer, but I just make so many mistakes, to be honest with you, in coding that I think Michael kind of said, why don't you go do this other stuff, because you make too many bugs. So in the actual, like, Michael McMahon was such a better coder, I think, really than either of us. So the two Michaels really, I think, by this time were doing most of the real nuts and bolts work of iMuse. That's my memory of it anyway.
In 1997, you were credited for Guybrush floating theme and Stan's theme on The Curse of Monkey Island. What can you share about your work on this game, given the fact that it's been 6 years since the last Monkey Island you worked on at that point?
The Guybrush floating theme, is this the underwater music maybe? Or is, because there's also the screenshot music, and we're talking about the 97 Monkey, right?
Yeah,
Monkey
Curse.
3.
Yeah.
So I get them all mixed up, honestly. Curse is 3.
Yeah.
What's 2?
LeChuck's Revenge.
LeChuck's Revenge. Thank you. Oh, of course. Oh, jeez. So yeah, that's right. I think I did 3 pieces in the Curse, if I remember right, and I might be mixing that up with Monkey 4. What's the you say I have 2 credits in Monkey 3.
In Monkey 3, you have 2 credits. So one of them is for Stan's theme, and you have special thanks, but you also have Guybrush floating theme.
I'm thinking that Guybrush floating theme is the one that happens when you're in the map.
Guybrush floating theme was written by you, Leon Suzanne, Paul Zabierek, Greg Land, John Castillo, like all of you guys.
Yeah, I mean, I know there was one theme in one of the later Monkeys, and I think it was Monkey 3, that was the that went da 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 Da, 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 da. And that theme was actually one that I wrote for Monkey 2, but we just couldn't find a place for it. So I just kept it around. And then we put it in a later Monkey. Yeah, and I'm not sure that, and that's what I'm saying is now Stan's theme. Stan's theme is it's funny because it's not really technically by me. It's Go Tell Aunt Rhody. It's an old, probably English folk song. Go Tell Aunt Rhody, the old gray goose is dead.
Well,
might be American.
It's a rendition of Stan's theme, so
yeah. Stan's theme itself is actually a version that I did this in Monkey 2 because in Monkey 2, Stan was selling coffins, right? And I thought it would be funny if Stan's theme had was a version of Go Tell Aunt Rhody, the old gray goose is dead. And that became associated with Stan.
In 1998, you were credited for music on Grim Fandango. Now, the soundtrack itself consists of several 1 minute to 2 minute tracks. How were these tracks incorporated into the game using iMuse in order to make them loop seamlessly in case the player lingers in a particular location?
There are several that are on the order of 1 minute. That's true. It's just a pretty simple looping technology. One thing that we did, I think, maybe before other folks, is that we pretty much never would loop to the beginning of a song. We would always loop to a place after the beginning of the song, so that because there's nothing, when you hear that beginning of a song again, you are it's so just driven into your skull that you have a loop. It's like, oh, there's the beginning again. Whereas if you go to some place that's like after the intro, it's kind of like, oh, they're repeating. It's very different from that kind of a loop, from what I would call a hard loop. So Grimm is all the kind of loop where there's not a single loop in Grimm that goes back to the very beginning of the song. And the other thing we did in Grimm actually was there are a lot of pieces that don't loop. There are a lot of pieces that just play and then they trail off and they're done, and it's sound design. We wanted to be more cinematic with Grimm because we were, I'm a musician and I love hearing music as much as the next guy. But honestly, when I first started working on games like Monkey, I'm like, man, this music is incessant. I mean, does it ever stop? I can't think. I can't even solve the puzzle. And of course, it was more necessary on a game like Monkey because we didn't have sound design like you do in them. So the music had to do kind of almost triple duty in the early games. It had to cover for the fact that you didn't have sound. You didn't have wind, you didn't have footsteps, you didn't have all that stuff. It was really like opera almost, or an old talkie movie that has the piano playing the whole time, right? And there was no dialogue in the early games either. So the music really had to do so much work in games like Monkey, which is one reason why people still remember that music, I think. But when it came to Grimm, it's like, we can actually do, first of all, we can do 3D now, which was a big deal. And Tim very cleverly chose a game about skeletons because they would look better in 3D than other things you could animate. So that was there was so much really genius going on in that game design. And I wanted to be as partly because we only had a budget and space for a certain amount of music, but also partly because I just wanted it to be more like a real movie score that I didn't want to have loops most of the time. I wanted to have there to be a gist, and then it would fade out. So there's certain situations where you do have a loop. Say when you walk out of Manny's office and you hear the radio playing. Well, the radio's playing, and it doesn't get turned off, so it makes sense that you would loop that piece, the Mr. Frustration Man. But in Manny's office music, actually that might loop. I'm trying to remember. I actually can't remember, but it's very spare. It's basically a clarinet solo that kind of dies off. And the way the score was constructed was basically I made a big map of the game and did like a 15-second gist for every place. And some of those gists just ended up staying 15-second gists, like the cactus outside of Rubacava. It's just a vibe, and then it's gone, right? And then others were more constant. So we did another thing with that game too that was pretty cool. We had remember I was talking about, we tried to make the system so that it would be more streamlined and not as much of a burden on the production team to actually deal with all these little, musical transitions and so forth. Well, one thing that happens is that there are fewer IMU style transitions in Grimm. That's one thing. Another is there are these just that die out, and then you just get sound design, which is kind of more realistic in a certain way, right? But another thing that we did is that that sort of middleware piece that I was talking about earlier in the technical discussion about IMUs, we made it so that it was data driven, and there were just these arrays that you could type in what transitions to what and under what circumstances. And it wasn't ideal because when you're composing music, like the last thing in the world you want to do is open up a C file and type stuff in. It's not what you want to do when you're making. But didn't have to do that often, and it was a nice sort of structural way to do things. And it corresponded to this little utility that we had on a Mac that you could see a map of the game with buttons for each location. You could press each button and then press another button. It would execute the transition of the music that goes to that new location. You could test it that way, but you could also get this feeling of the overall gestalt of the score. Like you could click around and see what it's like. And we built this by, we did the technical piece, and then we took Tim and Larry the O, one of our sound designers, fantastic musician in his own right. And Larry played bongos, and Tim talked about every single location in the game. And he would almost like beat poetry. Like he'd be like, oh, Manny's office. Well, Manny's office is like, it's just Manny in there. And he's got his desk, and he's got his little tube thing that the mail comes through. And we did that about literally every single location. We did a whole day of recording Tim talking about the game. And then I took all of his speeches about each room, and I attached them to each button, so that the first version of the Grimm Fandango score was literally Tim talking about every single place in the game, and you could click on a button and hear him saying. And then as I would do a sketch, first just a little gist in samples, right? Then eventually the full piece, and then finally the fully recorded version, with live musicians, everything. So you start with Tim's voice, and then it would get replaced by a little gist, and you click around. There'd be some Tim's voices and some little musical pieces. And eventually all the Tim's voices got replaced by a full score.
You should have kept it for
how,
the remastered version. You should have re-added it to the game.
Which, you mean Tim stuff?
Yeah, just clicking on stuff and getting Tim's audio
that
description.
That still exists. Unfortunately, it only runs on a Mac Plus. So, and I actually got it to work and when I did a little demo of it at GDC at the Game Developers Conference. I got it to work on an emulator in that little lecture, but it was kind of it wasn't quite all the way there. So yeah, some of that stuff just gets lost. Technology doesn't stand still.
Since we're short on time, I'm going to skip to the bonus questions.
Okay.
Even great composers like Hans Zimmer reuse some of their work across different projects. For example, a musical cue from a battle scene in Gladiator became prominent in the Pirates of the Caribbean. Do you ever allow yourself to bring elements from one game to another? And if not, what steps do you take to avoid it?
The short answer is no, unless it's the same story. So there's the Psychonauts 2 is full of Psychonauts 1 music. That's kind of the point, similar to the Star Wars movies where like new themes are introduced in each movie, but there are the core themes that remain the same. So in that sense, sure, things will get a second life in another game, but it's very deliberate, and it's very I didn't know that thing about Gladiator and Pirates, by the way. But Hans Zimmer lives in a different world, and I can because he owns his music. We don't own our music in the games business, so we have to be very careful about how we use themes that we have been how I would say contracted to write. There and in Hollywood, I'm a little surprised by the Zimmer story, because there was actually a case in Godfather 2 of Nino Rota, I think, as the composer, got his was it in Godfather 2? He got his Academy Award yanked because I just learned about this the other day, because he used a theme from another movie it was his theme. But it was like, for some reason, the Academy thought, oh, well, this is, it's cheating, or it's somehow not legit to reuse your own musical theme in a different movie. So, and he was really, I think, justifiably angry about it. And I don't know what finally happened, whether it finally got restored or not. But there is a very strong, sort of artistic kind of prejudice or whatever, feeling that you shouldn't do that. So when you do that, it's very intentional. So, for example, like I say, Psychonauts, those themes, not only are they reused, but it would be bad if I didn't, because Raz has a theme. He needs to have the same theme in the next movie.
Well, we're using it in sequels is fine, but Pirates of the Caribbean isn't a sequel to Gladiator. No,
not, and that's,
I'll send you that part.
And I would certainly, I don't know that particular situation, so it's hard for me to pass judgment on. But I would say that if I were certainly if it were a different publisher, I would be in big trouble if I used something that another client owned for this new client. So I would never do that. And I am very aware, I'm knock on wood, because this is always, you never know, especially at first, where your music comes from. It's a, inspiration is kind of a magical thing. But if something comes from someone else, or something comes from some other source, in my stuff, I usually get a little feeling like, I think I've heard that before. I'm gonna keep track of that. And usually within at least, it's usually no longer than a day. Sometimes it's a little longer. I can usually pinpoint the 3 or 4 different sources that melody came from. And I see I'm my own AI. What do you call it?
Detector.
Yeah, detective. And most of the time, I'd say, maybe like 80% of the time or something, I'll go like, you know what, that's okay. Okay. So it's a little bit like Louie Louie, but it's also a little bit like, the Moonlight Sonata or something. That's okay. I'm not going to worry about that. But there's the other 20% of the time where I go, and it could be from me, something I did, or it could be from something someone else did, where I'm like, no, I'm either going to change it or I'm going to scrap it. That I get that feeling that it actually comes from somewhere, and I feel like, I better change it.
Maybe someone from DreamWorks will watch this conversation and then decide to sue Disney for the Pirates of the Caribbean soundtrack. So stay tuned.
Well, like I said, I'm not sure who owns that soundtrack, because it in terms of actual legality, it may in fact be that Hans Zimmer was commissioned to write that music, but that I'm going to guess that he actually owns the intellectual property that is the music, and that he can do what he wants with it.
Okay.
And there would be an artistic objection if it's like, oh, well, that's too much like what you did and such and such. But as far as legality goes, it's like, I don't know. But I like I said, I don't know the details of Hans Zimmer's contract, or haven't heard the 2 pieces, and there's so many things that the question of plagiarism or influence, it's never going to go away. It's always going to be an issue, and it's something that you have to really face in good faith.
I'll get him for a 4-hour conversation, and I'll ask him.
Okay.
And one final question from me.
Mm-hmm.
What are your plans for 2024, and how can people stay in touch with you and your work?
Well, let's see. My plans for 2024 are as usual, top secret, and 2025 especially. But I can say that there's new Hearthstone music out there, and Hearthstone also has they released OST this year, which I think is pretty great, and that's so that's available on Spotify and all the usual places. Let's see what else is there? Is there anything?
Wait, so 2024 and 2025 are top secret. When will we find out what that top secret project is in 2026?
I can't say.
2027? Yeah. In this decade? In this century?
The thing is, first of all, I'm not in charge of that stuff, and secondly, the people who are in charge of that stuff aren't always right. So, there's no way to know. I couldn't say when we would know, but so right now, the latest stuff would be, the Hearthstone OST got released. I also actually released an album of songs that I sing, kind of rootsy songs that I did for Meta, and I'm really proud of that record. And that's on Spotify. It's called Better Place. It's on and Apple Music and the usual suspects. And that's just me singing, playing a slide guitar, and with some pretty amazing musicians. Very different from Grim Fandango, but maybe it has a little touch of Hearthstone in it. I don't know. Actually, it's not that different from Grim Fandango because there's some swing tunes in it. And yeah, I think that's the latest.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Peter, for taking time out of your very busy schedule to join me for this conversation. It's been a pleasure talking to you today.
Likewise.